January 5, 1943. Off Guadalcanal. The Aichi D-3A dive bomber screams past the USS Helena, banking hard, adrenaline-soaked pilot convinced he's clear. Behind him, 12 5-inch guns track the departing silhouette. Lieutenant Red Cochran doesn't hesitate. Fire. The shell leaves the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. 20,000 G-forces slam against circuits smaller than a pack of cigarettes. Glass vacuum tubes, 5 of them, each tinier than your thumb, survive what should pulverize them to dust. The projectile spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it streaks upward. It never touches the aircraft. 75 feet away, something awakens inside the shell. A miniature radio begins screaming into the void and hears an echo. Metal, close. The frequency shifts. A circuit closes. The valve disintegrates mid-flight. No direct hit, no lucky shot. The shell exploded in empty air and still killed. Cochran's crew stares in disbelief. They've just fired the first shot of a technological revolution that no one will talk about for 2 more years. A billion-dollar secret that will rewrite the rules of modern warfare. A device so valuable that generals will refuse to use it over land for fear a single dud might fall into enemy hands. The Japanese pilot never knew what killed him. Neither did the next 200 aircraft shot down by weapons that seemed to read minds. Shells that knew when they were close enough to kill. Engineers had sworn it was impossible. Physics said the components would shatter under firing stress. Every prior attempt had failed. But inside that 5-inch shell spinning through Pacific air, 130 miniature electronic components did something unprecedented. They exploded before they hit anything. And in doing so, they changed everything. Stay with this story, because what happened next defied every assumption about what was technically possible in 1943. By 1940, the Allies faced an engineering nightmare disguised as a tactical crisis. Anti-aircraft gunners needed to predict where a maneuvering aircraft would be in 3 seconds, set a mechanical timer on the shell, fire, and hope. Against modern fighters pulling 6G turns, this was educated guessing at best. The numbers told a brutal story. Conventional shells required over 500 rounds to down a single aircraft. Most rounds exploded harmlessly in empty sky, either too early or too late. Contact fuses? Worthless unless you directly hit a fast-moving target smaller than a house. The U.S. Navy watched Japanese aircraft devastate Pearl Harbor with a sickening realization. Their ships had no effective defense against aerial attack. Every carrier, every cruiser, every destroyer was vulnerable. As one officer noted, almost no one ever hit an airplane with the old-fashioned fuses. It would be just a sheer stroke of luck. In August 1940, Vannevar Bush's National Defense Research Committee assigned the impossible problem to physicist Merle Tuve at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. His mission: create a fuse that would detonate when near its target, not on impact, not at a preset time, near. Simple concept, impossible execution. You needed a miniature radio transmitter and receiver crammed into a shell casing. You needed vacuum tubes that wouldn't shatter under forces that would crush steel. You needed electronics that could survive being fired from a gun, something that violated every known principle of electrical engineering in 1940. Germany had tried. Over 30 different proximity fuse designs developed or researched. None reached combat service. Britain had tried. Their scientists concluded the technical difficulties were insurmountable, at least during World War II. Now it was America's turn. Tuve assembled a team of physicists who specialized in one thing: achieving the impossible under crushing time pressure.
The race was on, and the enemy was already winning in the Pacific. Inside the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, teams attacked the problem from multiple angles simultaneously. Optical sensors? Too fragile. Acoustic triggers? Unreliable. Capacitive detection? Limited range. Radio frequency sensing emerged as the only viable approach. But that created the central paradox. Vacuum tubes of 1940 were delicate glass bulbs the size of your fist. When fired from a 5-inch gun, the shell experiences an instantaneous setback force of 20,000 Gs, enough to liquefy human tissue. Then the rifling grooves grab the shell, spinning it to 25,000 revolutions per minute. Centrifugal forces tear at everything inside. Enter James Van Allen, a young physicist who would later discover Earth's radiation belts. His singular obsession, creating vacuum tubes that could survive artillery fire. He spent months at testing ranges, watching tubes explode, redesigning, testing again. The breakthrough came from hearing aid technology, miniature tubes from Western Electric and RCA, radically reinforced. Each tube was smaller than a lipstick, 5 per fuse. The circuitry had to be equally robust. Engineers at Applied Physics Laboratory, newly formed in March 1942 when TÜV's team outgrew Carnegie, developed a transmitter that continuously broadcast at 180 megahertz. When the signal reflected off nearby metal, the Doppler shift created by relative motion triggered a discriminator circuit. The entire device contained 130 miniaturized electronic components packed into a space the size of a soda can. Safety mechanisms were critical. The fuse couldn't arm immediately after firing. It might explode too close to the gun crew. It needed a self-destruct mechanism if it didn't detonate. It required a power source, a battery that could survive the firing shock and deliver steady voltage while spinning wildly. By summer 1942, after countless failures and redesigns, Section T had something revolutionary, a device that could sense proximity, discriminate between targets and ground, and reliably detonate, if it worked. Everything hinged on the next test.
August 12, 1942, Chesapeake Bay. The light cruiser USS Cleveland sits at anchor, her 5-inch guns loaded with ammunition that shouldn't exist. 3 radio-controlled drones buzz overhead, weaving evasively. The test was scheduled for 2 days. Navy observers expected incremental improvement over conventional shells, maybe 40% better hit rates. The first salvo fires. Instant detonation. 1 drone tumbles from the sky in pieces. Gunners adjust, fire again. Another drone explodes. The third follows moments later. 4 shells fired, 3 drones destroyed. Controllers frantically maneuvered the drones as hard as the remote systems allowed. Didn't matter. The Navy canceled Day 2 immediately. They'd seen enough. Crosley, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris received production orders that same week. By September 1942, the first accepted fuses rolled off assembly lines. Production began at 500 units daily, painfully slow, but accelerating. 5 months later, Lieutenant Cochran's gun crews aboard Helena experienced what Cleveland's test had proved. The shell doesn't need to hit, it just needs to get close. The Val dive bomber that exploded 75 feet from Helena's shell was the first of what would become hundreds of Japanese aircraft killed by near misses. Within weeks, word spread through the Pacific Fleet via hushed conversations in ready rooms and wardrooms. Something had changed. Gunners whispered about the funny fuse that turned near misses into kills. Exact mechanism? Classified. Effectiveness? Undeniable. Admiral William Bull Halsey's task forces suddenly found themselves surviving night attacks by Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers that should have devastated them. Planes that evaded conventional fire now exploded in mid-air, bracketed by shells that seemed to anticipate their positions. Japanese pilots couldn't understand why American anti-aircraft fire suddenly became so lethal.
They reported shells that exploded without hitting anything, phantom detonations that shredded aircraft from distances that should have been safe zones. And the Allies weren't telling.
By 1943, intelligence officers in Tokyo were analyzing disturbing patterns. American gunfire effectiveness had tripled seemingly overnight. Standard evasive maneuvers, once reliable, now resulted in catastrophic losses. After-action reports described shells that detonated in proximity to aircraft without direct contact. They suspected a new fuse. They couldn't prove it. U.S. Navy doctrine transformed rapidly. Statistical analysis from Pacific operations revealed staggering numbers. Although only 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition used proximity fuses in 1943, those shells accounted for 51% of all Japanese aircraft shot down by naval gunfire, 3 times more effective than conventional time fuses. The lethal fragment area jumped from 60 square feet to 3,000 square feet. Night kill ratios increased by 370%. Admiral Mark Mitcher's Fast Carrier Task Force became nearly untouchable. Every 5-inch gun firing VT-fused ammunition, planes falling by the dozens. By late 1944, the effectiveness ratio climbed to 600% compared to conventional fuses, even accounting for a 30% dud rate. But the Pentagon remained paranoid about security. Overland operations, forbidden. The risk that a dud shell might fall into German or Japanese hands outweighed tactical advantages. Every fuse contained a self-destruct mechanism, but engineers couldn't guarantee 100% reliability. Production scaled exponentially, from 500 fuses daily in late 1942 to 40,000 daily by late 1943. Over 100 manufacturers and subcontractors participated. 80,000 workers, 3% of all American physicists, involved in some aspect of the program. Procurement contracts exploded. $60 million in 1942, $200 million in 1943, $450 million by 1945. Sylvania's plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts alone produced 5.6 million fuses, more than any other single location. Women worked assembly lines under armed guard, told they were making radio tubes for unspecified military purposes. The secrecy ranked second only to the Manhattan Project. And then, in June 1944, German V-1 rockets began falling on London. Everything changed. June 13, 1944, England's southern coast. Radar operators watch blips accelerate toward London at 400 miles per hour. V-1 buzz bombs, Hitler's vengeance weapon. Small, fast, packed with explosives. Conventional anti-aircraft fire stops 17%, barely acceptable losses. Gunner crews along the coastal belt receive new ammunition. No explanation, just orders. Use these. The first V-1 approaches. Gun crews track. Fire. The shell streaks upward. Doesn't touch the V-1. Doesn't need to. At 70 feet distance, the fuse senses metal moving at closing velocity. Circuit closes. Detonation. Shrapnel cloud intercepts the crew's missile at precise angle. The V-1 disintegrates. Warhead detonates over empty farmland instead of Piccadilly Circus. Again, another V-1. Another interception. By the end of the first week, kill rates climb from 17% to 40%. Within 4 weeks, 79%. Gunners can barely believe what they're seeing. Fast-moving targets that should be nearly impossible to hit are falling like clay pigeons. The statistics tell the story starkly. Of 9,300 V-1s launched between June and August, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire accounts for the destruction of most that don't reach their targets. On the campaign's final day, radar detects 104 incoming V-1s, 68 destroyed by VT-fused shells. Of the remainder, only 4 reach London. Churchill will later write, "These so-called proximity fuses, made in the United States, proved potent against the small, unmanned aircraft. The weapon that was too secret to use over land finally showed what it could do.
Hundreds of thousands of London civilians never knew that miniature radio circuits in American-made shells saved their lives by exploding in empty air. September 1944. Antwerp faces V-1 bombardment. British 11th Armored Division desperately needs modified fuses. Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati rushes production. Churchill personally authorizes special Lancaster bomber flights to transport fuses across the Atlantic. One anti-aircraft unit destroys 48 of the first 75 V-1s encountered. The port of Antwerp stays open. Allied supply lines hold. The physics behind proximity detonation is elegant brutality. Each VT fuse contains a miniature radar system broadcasting at 180 MHz continuously. The 4-tube Hartley oscillator transmitter sends signals outward through a small antenna cap on the nose. As the shell approaches a target, aircraft, ground, cruise missile, reflected signals return to the receiving circuit. Doppler effect provides the discrimination. When shell and target approach each other, the reflected frequency shifts upward. This frequency change activates a discriminator circuit that distinguishes between genuine targets and ground clutter or other shell's transmissions. When the frequency shift indicates optimal detonation distance, typically 70 to 75 feet, a thyrotron tube fires. The firing sequence happens in microseconds. Thyrotron closes circuit. Current flows to a small explosive charge in the fuse base. Main explosive in the shell detonates. Fragmentation pattern optimized for lateral dispersion, precisely where aircraft are most vulnerable and armor is thinnest. Against ground targets, fuses are calibrated differently, detonating 20 to 50 feet above terrain. This creates an airburst effect. Shrapnel rains downward over maximum area. Soldiers in trenches who would survive ground-burst shells have no protection against overhead fragmentation clouds covering thousands of square feet. The engineering tolerances are microscopic. Tube filaments must maintain structural integrity under 20,000 G setback forces. Solder joints can't crack under centrifugal forces equivalent to small car crushing inward. Battery chemistry must deliver steady voltage despite violent rotation. Radio circuitry can't drift out of calibration despite extreme vibration. Reliability? Approximately 70% under combat conditions. Not perfect, but revolutionary compared to conventional fuses requiring direct hits or perfect timing. Sources conflict on some specifications. Some documents cite detection ranges from 50 to 100 feet, depending on target size. Detonation altitude over ground varies from reports of 10 to 70 feet based on shell type and tactical purpose. What's undisputed, the Mark 32 fuse for the Navy's 5-inch 38 caliber gun changed warfare. There was simply no defense. The shells exploded overhead. We couldn't see them coming. We couldn't predict impact. Men began refusing orders to leave their bunkers. The psychological warfare component was unintentional but devastating. Soldiers understand risk. Direct fire, you take cover. Mortars, you hear the whistle, you dive. Artillery with time fuses, you watch for impacts, learn patterns. But proximity fuses eliminated prediction. Shells detonated overhead with no warning signatures. Random, inescapable. One captured German soldier described it as quick, powerful bursts for which there was simply no defense. Another reported that entire units experienced what modern psychologists would classify as learned helplessness, the futile realization that no tactical response improved survival odds. American gun crews experienced inverse psychology. They watched previously difficult targets become almost trivial. Aircraft that required sustained fire now fell after brief bursts. The confidence boost rippled through entire formations. Fire control officers calculated shorter engagement times, which allowed faster response to multiple threats. Aboard ships, crews witnessed kamikaze attacks. The ultimate psychological warfare gets systematically shredded by proximity-fused fire. Admiral Arleigh Burke later testified, "Those fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. Without that fuse, our ship losses would have been enormously larger." The secrecy created its own stress. Assembly line workers in Ipswich and Cincinnati soldered components with no understanding of purpose. Armed guards, classified protocols. Some workers weren't told they were building proximity fuses until after the war ended. One woman believed she was soldering the tips of light bulbs for 20 years. Japanese pilots reported invisible barriers around American fleets. Some intelligence officers speculated about magnetic ray guns or beam weapons. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. American shells could think. Not really, but close enough to rewrite every tactical manual in both theaters of war.
December 16, 1944. Battle of the Bulge erupts. German forces capture Allied ammunition dumps in initial breakthrough. Among the captured munitions, proximity-fused shells. Panic in Allied intelligence. Within 2 weeks, Wright Field engineers develop emergency electronic countermeasures in case Germany reverse engineers and deploys copycat fuses in their anti-aircraft guns. The countermeasure remains theoretical. German industry lacks capacity to produce miniature vacuum tubes at required scale and quality. German scientists had developed over 30 proximity fuse designs. Acoustic fuses triggered by engine sound. Electrostatic designs based on capacitive effects. Radio frequency concepts similar to Allied approaches. None achieved production status. The manufacturing bottleneck wasn't conceptual understanding, it was precision electronics at scale under wartime conditions. Japan faced identical limitations. Intelligence officers correctly deduced American shells contained some form of radio detection system. Technical assessment: achievable in theory, impossible in practice given Japan's degraded industrial capacity by 1944. Strategic bombing had devastated precision manufacturing. Even if Japanese engineers could design equivalent fuses, production facilities didn't exist. Tactical adaptations emerged instead. Japanese pilots began approaching American task forces at extreme low altitude, hoping proximity fuses would detonate against ocean surface reflections. Sometimes effective, usually fatal. German infantry learned to remain in hardened positions during artillery preparation, knowing airburst shrapnel couldn't penetrate reinforced bunkers. But these were desperate improvisations, not solutions. Allied doctrine evolved too. Initially, VT fuses were reserved exclusively for over-water operations, where duds would sink. After V1 success, limited land use began. Battle of the Bulge marked full deployment. 200,000 proximity-fused shells, codenamed Posit, fired in December 1944 alone. General George Patton's after-action report: "We caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River with a battalion concentration. Killed by actual count 702. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. I think when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." He was right, but only one side had it. 22 million proximity fuses produced. Over $1 billion invested in 1940s currency, equivalent to $15 billion today. 5 separate manufacturers, 80 subcontractors, 110 factories, 80,000 workers. 3 critical secret projects won World War II. Everyone knows about the atomic bomb and radar. The proximity fuse was the third. Pacific Theater statistics illuminate its impact brutally. 278 Japanese aircraft destroyed by VT-fused fire. Analysis indicates conventional time fuses would have accounted for only 46. Naval historians suggest the fuse's effectiveness may have contributed to Japan's adoption of kamikaze tactics, desperation replacing conventional attack runs that became suicide missions. The device that couldn't be built, according to British and German engineers, became one of the most significant force multipliers in military history. It didn't just increase lethality, it fundamentally altered tactical calculations on both sides. Modern warfare inherited its DNA. Phoenix AM-54 air-to-air missiles, standard SM-2 surface-to-air missiles,
Patriot missiles that defended against Scuds in 1991. Even today's proximity detection systems in artillery, mines, and bombs trace lineage back to Merle Tube Section T and the impossible vacuum tubes James Van Allen engineered to survive forces that should have crushed them. The Mark 32 fuse and its 59 successor variants developed during the war remained classified until 1945. Workers who'd spent years assembling components learned their purpose from newspaper headlines. USS Helena crew members who shot down that first Val off Guadalcanal didn't know they'd fired the opening shot of a technological revolution until decades later. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal. The proximity fuse helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without this ingenious device, our westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. The weapon that exploded before it hit anything saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. Every event, number, and name in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources.